And in this video, we're going to take an extensive look into the weeks leading up to the murders of Patrick Tate, Tony Tucker and Craig Rolfe. In this video, we're going to take a look at the situation regarding Tony Tucker. In particular, the dud cannabis deal, the Leah Betts situation, and also his behaviour in the weeks leading up to their deaths.
Welcome back. It was a crime which pushed everything else off the front pages. 3 men, all known criminals, found shot dead in the Essex countryside. It was a cold-blooded, professional killing. The victims had many enemies, but which one wanted them executed?
And welcome back to a new video on the Essex Boys case. As always, if you are enjoying the content, please do give the video a thumbs up. And if you're interested in the Essex Boys case, or simply true crime in general, don't forget to hit the subscribe button below. Now, the best place to start with this video is, I would say, probably the last 4 weeks leading up to the murders of Tucker, Tate and Rolfe. Interestingly, we have a statement here from a man called Guy Garwood. Now, this is the brother of Donna Garwood, the then girlfriend of Tony Tucker. He gives us a bit of an insight into Tony's behaviour during this time period. The following police statement is from Guy Garwood, dated the 13th of December 1995. My sister is Donna Garwood. She was recently having a relationship with the deceased Tony Tucker. I was first aware that Donna was seeing Tony around November 1994. I first saw them together at Raquel's discotheque in Basildon around that time. I was aware that he used to spend a lot of money on her and that Donna idolised him. Because of the age gap between them, I was a bit concerned and took it upon myself to speak to my dad about him. My dad, Brian Garwood, runs a panel beating business at 1A Wanstead Park Road, Ilford. Shortly after I spoke to my dad, he told me he had spoken to a man named Dave De Freitas who had connections with people in the East London area club scene. My dad told me that the feeling was that although Tony was a big man who could be nasty, he wouldn't be a problem with my sister. It went on that they used to spend a lot of time together. Tony didn't come to my mum's house because she wasn't that keen at first, but tried to come to terms with their relationship. I knew that Tony's current friends were Craig Rolfe and Pat Tate. I was never certain of what the three of them got up to, but I knew Tony used to run a lot of the doormen in Basildon and at Southend as well. I remember Donna told me once that Pat Tate had come out of prison. She said, "He's only been out 5 weeks." She said that since Pat had come out, Tony had become worried about something. He had taken a bit of a low profile. He wasn't himself. Donna said he started staying in with her a lot and Tony was a bit jumpy. Donna said she thought Pat had done something which reflected on Tony, but she didn't say what. Around the beginning of December or the end of November, I came home to my mother's house, 33 Fairview Road, Basildon, and found Donna sitting in Pat's black 190 Mercedes. Donna had only recently passed her test, but had difficulty driving it as I understood from her. She had driven it from Pat Tate's bungalow in Gordon Road. At that time, Donna was living at Swanstead number 122 or 123. I ended up driving the car back to Pat Tate's address. I cannot remember the index number. I knew Tony had a black Porsche which got smashed up by Pat Tate. The blue Range Rover, as I knew it, was Pat Tate's. Before they started using the Range Rover, they were using a brown Ford Granada on an A or B plate. I have not heard any rumours about Tony Tucker, Pat Tate or Craig Rolfe. For my part, I thought they were just involved in running the doorman on the clubs. I do not know of anyone who may be involved in their murders. So what we are going to do now is take a step backwards. We're going to take a look at the police statement from a man by the name of Barry Dorman. What's really good and interesting about this police statement is that it gives us some background into Tate's younger years and also some potential hostility brewing between Pat Tate and Tony Tucker. The following police statement is from Barry Dorman, dated the 8th of December 1995. I'm the above named person and I live at the address Overleaf with my daughter. I have lived at this address for the last 16 years. Around 18 or 19 years ago, I was working as a shift engineer at Tunnel Refineries Greenwich. At this time, I was buying and selling cars in my spare time, and as a result of this, I met a man called Patrick Tate. At this time, Pat was living in Haven Gore Pitsea, and he was about 19 to 20 years old. My contact with Pat continued as I started to see him attending car auctions. As a result of this, we continued our contact on a friendly business basis, but our contact was limited to the dealing in second-hand cars. About 11 years ago, I had a serious car accident, and as a result of my injuries, I had to give up my full-time job at Tunnel Refineries. After about a year, as a result of my continued contact with Pat Tate, it was suggested by him that I try the second-hand car trade full-time. It was through Pat that I managed to acquire the rented forecourt located at the junction of the old A13 and One Tree Hill. At this time, the garage was called Eastern Garage, and the forecourt was a separate entity alongside. I took up the forecourt with my cousin Stephen Dillon, who was already a car trader in London. We named the forecourt Cousin Cars and began trading in 1985. My contact with Pat Tate increased as he was running another car front on Canvey Island called Beach Autos. My contact with Pat was still limited to a friendly business basis. After about 5 years, my cousin and I had a big fallout, and as a result we parted company. I continued to trade and was joined at the site by a man called Graham Law, who at that time was also trading from the Five Bells roundabout site on the A13. After a period of time, the two garages amalgamated as Eastern Garage Car Sales, and I ran the Five Bells site and Graham ran the One Tree Hill site. We have continued like this to date. About this time I became aware that Pat Tate had become involved with the police in respect of some criminal matter and that he was in custody. I can remember being contacted by his girlfriend Sarah Saunders, who told me that the police had seized about £20,000 from Pat, which they believed was drug-related money. It was the first time it was mentioned that Pat may be involved in the dealing of drugs, although I had been aware that Pat took or used cocaine himself. I had known Sarah Saunders for many years, as her grandmother lived very near to my own house. She asked me to help Pat by showing that the money was related to car dealing, not drug dealing, and to do this she asked me to find for her all of the car invoices which related to car trades between Pat and myself. I did this and handed them to Sarah, and as a result I was required to attend Chelmsford Crown Court at a later date to give evidence at Pat's trial. I was later told by Sarah that Pat had been convicted of robbery and had been sentenced to a long term of imprisonment. Whilst Pat was in prison, he contacted me, and as a result I went to visit him at a prison in Kent. He asked me to sort out a vehicle for Sarah Saunders, which I agreed to do. I also visited Pat one other time when he had phoned and asked me to go and see him. My next contact with Pat was when I was invited to Pat's release party at Sarah Saunders' mother's address. At this party I was introduced to a person by the name of Stephen Ellis by Pat, as well as a number of friends and family. I can also remember spending time with a man I know as Bill Baxter. I knew Bill Baxter through the car trade, and I knew that Bill had some involvement with Pat in respect of a car front in Southend. Bill Baxter now runs the car front opposite Nova Car Sales on the London Road, Leigh-on-Sea, and I believe Pat Tate still has a financial involvement with Bill Baxter. After the party, I can remember Stephen Ellis and Pat coming down to my car site with a view to Stephen buying a vehicle. At this time, I can remember Stephen Ellis having about £7,000 in cash to spend. To my recollection, this would have been about 18 months ago. Ellis did not buy a vehicle from me, but I knew that he had originally come to me on Pat's recommendations. My contact with Pat continued as before, with reasonably regular contact through the trade and the sale of a number of vehicles to Pat. I would describe my relationship with Pat as friendly, although we did not socialise outside of work. It was around this sort of time that Pat started talking about a man called Tony Tucker, who he said he had met at a nightclub where Tony was working as a doorman. I had never met Tony, but I can remember Pat talking about him. It was around this time that I was told that Pat had been shot and he was in Basildon Hospital. I went to the hospital with Graham Law to see Pat, and when I was there, Pat's brother Russell turned up. Although I had known Russell was a car trader, I've had very little to do with him. We only stayed with Pat for about 10 minutes, as I merely wanted to let him know that I had heard and passed on my good wishes. Although I had this regular contact with Pat and we had built up a trust between us, he never told me any details of what he was involved in other than to do with cars. As Pat knew, I had previously been in the Metropolitan Police Service for a short period, and I was also wary of Pat with his volatile temperament. I was always careful of what I asked Pat, in case he thought I was trying to get information from him. I was later told that the man I had met at Pat's party, Stephen Ellis, was possibly involved in the shooting, although I do not know whether there is any truth in this. I have never asked Pat about the shooting or his other business, as I know he would be suspicious of my reasons. I later became aware that the police had found a number of items in Pat's possession at hospital, and as a result he was returned to prison. I believe the items included a handgun, a quantity of cocaine and some tablets. I did not go and see Pat in prison, but I was asked by Pat through Sarah Saunders to dispose of his current vehicle, which was a black 928 S2 Porsche, index AN0928S. I took possession of the vehicle from Sarah, and after having some work done on it, I put it up for sale on my car front for around £8,995. When I had the car, I received a phone call from Pat in prison telling me to keep the money if I sold the car and not to give it to Sarah or anyone else. I had the vehicle for a couple of months, and during this time I took 2 deposits on the car, but the sales fell through. When I took the deposits, I used to put a sold sign on the vehicle, and when I did this I received a visit from the man called Tony Tucker. At this time I think I'd met Tucker once or twice when he'd attended the car front with Pat before he was returned to prison. When he came to my garage, Tucker told me to give him the money whilst Pat was in prison. Although I had heard about Tony and I did not want to cross him, I was more concerned about crossing Pat, and therefore I told Tony I would not give him the money. When I stood my ground, I told him what Pat had said. Tony seemed to accept it and left my garage. I kept the car for a couple of months but could not sell it. I therefore returned it to Sarah Saunders. In this time I only saw Tony Tucker once more when he came up to my car front on a horse and asked me if I had any luck selling it. At this time I had become aware of Tony moving into a house in Fobbing High Road with a large plot of land. I had a couple of phone calls from Pat whilst he was in prison, but they appeared to be merely for a chat rather than anything specific. The next time I saw Pat was when he came down to my car front after he had been released from prison. This was at the end of October 95, beginning of November. I believe at this time he was on his own and we had a general chat about domestic and general matters. At this time he appeared quite level-headed and normal. My next contact with Pat and Tony Tucker was when they came to my garage after Pat had an accident in Tony's black Porsche 928 S4, index 9TT. The vehicle was badly damaged and Pat was asking me to sort it out as cheaply as possible. The vehicle was brought to the One Tree Hill site and my daughter spent a lot of time trying to locate cheap second-hand spares for the repair. I also arranged for quotes to carry out the bodywork. As a result of the Porsche repairs, I began to have virtual day-to-day contact with either Pat, Tony or both. The majority of the time they were together and were accompanied by a younger man called Craig. At that time I had a blue Range Rover 3.5 Vogue SE, index F424 NPE on my forecourt, as I had recently taken that in as part exchange. I had purchased this vehicle from Mr. Herson of Kingston Road, Stanford-le-Hope, and I can produce a copy of the purchase invoice for this transaction as my exhibit BDT/1. This was purchased on the 2nd of November 1995. As Tony Tucker was now without a vehicle, he and Pat showed interest in purchasing the Range Rover, which I had for sale at £10,995. After some negotiation, I agreed to sell it to them for £9,800, but I knew that neither Pat or Tony would be able to get finance on the vehicle. When I pointed this out, Tony stated that his friend would be buying it on his behalf, but he would be using it. I agreed to accept a £2,000 deposit and put the remainder on finance. A friend of Tony's, a man who gave his name as Mr. P. Cuthbert, then attended my site and provided sufficient details for me to complete the finance agreement. I was handed £2,000 in cash at this time, but I'm unable to say which one of them gave it to me. They then took the keys from me and drove the vehicle away from my forecourt. I completed a sales invoice for the transaction and showed the purchaser as Tony Tucker. I can produce a copy of this invoice as my exhibit BDT/2. I then sent off the completed finance agreement and received my cheque from the company for the balance. I am still in possession of the registration document for the vehicle, which I can produce as exhibit BDT/3. The finance company would have issued a paying in book to Mr. P. Cuthbert to enable the monthly repayments to be made. This book would have been sent to Cuthbert's home address. The Range Rover was taken by Pat and Tony on the 14th of November 1995. From that day, when Pat, Tony and Craig visited my car front, they would be using the Range Rover. Craig would normally be the driver, with Pat in the front passenger seat and Tony in the back. As stated, I had a number of visits from them inquiring about the progress with the Porsche repairs. I can remember during one of their visits, Tony was really annoyed and stated they were trying to link him to the supply of the ecstasy tablet which killed the girl called Leah Betts. He stated that he knew who had supplied it as he had been told by one of the doormen. He also stated that he had made some checks and knew that the girl regularly took tablets and that she didn't even live with her father. He was really ranting and raving to Pat about it, and I heard him say that it was only because her dad was a policeman that such a fuss was being made. During the morning of Wednesday the 6th of December 1995, I was at the car front when Pat, Tony, Craig and Mr. P. Cuthbert arrived in the Range Rover. I would describe Mr. Cuthbert as male, white, 5'10" to 5'11", late 30s, reasonably fit build. I've been told he is a ceiling fixer. The four of them came into the office and I was handed by one of them the paying in book relating to the Range Rover finance, and between them they produced £321.40 in cash. I was asked by one of them, I can't remember who, to keep the book and remind them when the payments were due. I agreed to do this as it was in my interest to make sure the finance was paid. I had also been told by Pat and Tony at the time of purchasing the vehicle that they intended to pay it off in one lump fairly quickly. I paid this sum into the Barclays Bank at Pitsea Broadway the following day. I can produce the paying in book as my exhibit BDT/4. Sometime during an earlier meet with Pat, he had asked me whether I had a suitable vehicle for him to give to Sarah Saunders. He told me there had been a lot of problems between them and he wanted to give her a car to get her off of his back. I told him I had a VW Passat on the forecourt which I had taken in as part exchange on the 25th of the 11th, 95. I showed him the vehicle, which was metallic green in colour and had the registration number F120GGF. He agreed to take it for a test drive and we later agreed on a price of £1,800 for the vehicle. I can produce a purchase invoice for this VW Passat as my exhibit BDT/5. I left my forecourt around 1700 to 17:30 hours on Wednesday the 6th of December, intending to play my friend Keith Moore at squash. At this time, my daughter and an employee, Mickey Stenning, were at the car front. En route to squash, I received a phone call from Mickey Stenning stating that Herc, which is my pet name for Pat Tate, i.e. short for Hercules due to his size, had arrived at the car front to collect the VW Passat. Pat then came onto the phone and told me that he would still take the vehicle even though he didn't need it, as he had had a bust-up with Sarah Saunders. I told him that he didn't have to take it, but he insisted that he would. He told me that he would pay me for the vehicle in the morning, as he had, quote, a lump of money coming. As a result, I agreed to Pat taking the vehicle that night, which he did. The following morning, Thursday the 7th of December 1995, I returned to my car site around 9 AM. Between 11 and 12 midday, I was at the site talking to a customer when a female approached me and called me by my name, i.e. Bow. I did not recognise her, and as I was talking she appeared to move away. A short while later I returned to my office and the same woman approached me and said words to the effect of, "Bow, can they trace that Range Rover back to you?" Not knowing her, I said, "What Range Rover?" And she replied, "The one that Tony's been using." At that time I realised that she was referring to the Range Rover being used by Pat Tate and Tony Tucker. I asked her why, and she just replied, "Oh, nothing," and then she walked out of the office. I would describe this woman as female, white, 5'3", slim build, tanned freckled face, with mousy straight hair. I believe that she is the girlfriend of Tony Tucker. I was obviously concerned about why she had come in and asked that question, so I immediately tried to contact Pat Tate on his mobile telephone. When I called the number 0585 429 316, I got no reply, so I tried his other mobile number 0973 740 923. When this was answered, it was by a female who I did not recognise. I asked to speak to the big man, and she said he was out on a job. I asked if everything was alright, and she just said, yeah. I then tried to phone Tony on his mobile number of 0385 317 327, but all I got was Tony's answer phone. I did not leave a message. I then tried to phone Tony's home number of 01268 555 332, but that was unobtainable. I have not seen Tony Tucker, Pat Tate, Craig or Mr. Cuthbert since. Purely as background information, I am aware that Pat, Tony and Craig were heavily into bodybuilding and in their quest to increase their size were injecting substances. I believe that all three of them used a Progress gym for an hour each morning. Right, certainly a few things worthy of note during that police statement there. What I find particularly interesting is the fact that we have Pat Tate, who's been recalled to prison, and we have this sort of distrust, I believe personally, starting to develop between Pat Tate and Tony Tucker. We have Pat Tate speaking to Barry Dorman over the telephone and making it clear to Barry Dorman that if he were to sell this vehicle on behalf of Pat Tate, that he must keep the money himself. Do not give it to Sarah Saunders, do not give it to Tony Tucker, do not give it to Craig Rolfe, do not give it to anybody. Keep it for yourself for when I am out of prison. We then appear to have Tony Tucker, who strolls past the car lot, notices the sold sign on the vehicle which Pat Tate is selling, or which Barry Dorman is selling on Pat Tate's behalf, and he goes in to speak to Barry Dorman and asks for the money for that vehicle. You can just kind of imagine it, can't you? You know, him walking in there and saying, you know, I'm going to take this money, I'm going to look after it for Pat while he's in prison, and it really puts Barry Dorman in an incredibly uncomfortable position there. But Barry Dorman has stood his ground. He said, you know, I've heard from Pat. He has told me to keep hold of the money, and I'm afraid that's what I'm going to do. And by all accounts, this happened on more than one occasion. On each occasion that the sold sign was put on that vehicle, Tucker would arrive and ask for that money. And then we have quite a curious conversation which Barry Dorman overhears concerning Tucker, Tate and Rolfe. It's in this statement that he states the following. I can remember during one of their visits, Tony was really annoyed and stated that they were trying to link him to the supply of the ecstasy tablet which killed the girl called Leah Betts. He stated that he knew who had supplied it as he had been told by one of the doormen. He also stated that he had made some checks and knew that the girl regularly took tablets and that she didn't even live with her father. He was really ranting and raving to Pat about it, and I heard him say that it was only because her dad was a policeman that such a fuss was being made. Now this I find a little bit odd actually. So Tucker's there at the car front talking to Pat Tate, and is he trying to convince Tate here that he wasn't actually the supplier of the tablet for some reason? Because, I mean, from what I can gather from the documentaries and books I've read or whatever, it seemed to have been common knowledge, at least back then, that Tucker was the supplier of this ecstasy tablet. So why is he trying to convince Tate here that it was someone else? Also, another point worthy of note is the following. The Range Rover was taken by Pat and Tony on the 14th of the 11th, 95. From that day when Pat, Tony and Craig visited my car front, they would be using the Range Rover. Craig would normally be the driver with Pat in the front passenger seat and Tony in the back seat. So this is quite interesting because obviously we know when the bodies of Tucker, Tate and Rolfe were discovered, we had Craig was the driver, Tucker was the front seat passenger, and Pat was seated in the rear. I mean, could it be that Barry Dorman has simply got this wrong here? Was he supposed to say that Tucker was normally in the front and Tate was in the rear? The reason I say that is because of the statement from that tyre fitter who saw them on December the 6th. He claims to have seen the Range Rover travelling towards him, and he claimed that Craig Rolfe was the driver, Tucker was the front passenger, and there was a large male in the rear of the vehicle who he believed to have been Pat Tate, as that is how they had sat when he had seen them in the past. So really, make of that what you will. But playing devil's advocate here for just one moment, let's say that Barry Dorman is in fact correct, that the normal seating positions with these three individuals when they used to go out would be Rolfe driving, Tucker in the back and Tate up front. What would be the reason for Tate being in the rear of the vehicle on December the 6th? Well, let's just assume for one moment that there is in fact a fourth passenger in that Range Rover. I think naturally you'd believe that that individual would be closer to Pat Tate than the other two. It's kind of a natural thing, isn't it? If a friend of yours, or you're going to pick up a friend, they're going to sit in the back, then the person who actually knows that individual is going to sit in the back with them, aren't they? So could that lend us to believe that Pat actually knew that fourth passenger better than, say, the other two? I.e., if this was in fact Steele and this was a different seating arrangement than they normally used, then I guess that could go to explain it. And now we move to part of the statement from Sarah Saunders, who discusses the relationship between Tucker and Tate in a little bit more detail. It's during her police interview that the following occurs. DC Norton asks her, "So during the time then he was at Whitemore Prison, what's happening then in your life and the relationship with Mickey and Jackie particularly, and Pat and the business?" Saunders replies, "I don't know the dates of this, but Tony Tucker used to come round, I think once a week, and give me money for bills and to look after my son and whatever. I think Pat told me that he had heard that Tony had got a new house, the bungalow he'd bought in Fobbin, and Pat didn't like it very much because he thought that possibly, well, I don't know how much money Pat had, but he thought that possibly his money was going towards Tony's house, and he asked Mick if he could make up some excuse to get his money off of Tony. I'm not sure what Mick said, but I think it was something along the lines of he had a fine to pay off the mortgage. Mick got the money off of Tony because Pat trusted Mick more than Tony." So when Pat Tate was recalled to prison, Tate originally gave control of his finances over to Tony Tucker, but there seems to have been a little bit of a breakdown in their relationship during this time period. We've already got this discussion of Tate coming out of prison, Tony being paranoid by Tate's actions or something that Tate had done which reflected badly upon himself. And now we've got this situation where Tate, after being taken back to prison, has given full control of his finances over to Tony Tucker. It was Tucker's responsibility to pay Sarah Saunders X amount of money per week, but somewhere down the line, Tate seems to have had second thoughts. It's also mentioned later on in Sarah Saunders' statement that Tony didn't like Pat having friends. He was quite a jealous person, someone who was quite controlling really, and he didn't actually like Pat's close friends. He didn't like Steve Nipper Ellis. That was potentially why that whole falling out happened. And Tony liked to have control of everything, even down to Pat Tate and who he would socialise with. This is also echoed in some ways in the following newspaper article. The following newspaper article is from the 29th of the 2nd, 1996, with the headline, "Jealous drugs boss shot his own pal." Murdered drug baron Tony Tucker has been blamed for shooting his own friend Pat Tate and then supplying him with a gun and drugs while he was recovering in hospital. The fateful alleged shooting came a year before both men were slaughtered. Tucker, who was slain alongside Tate and Craig Rolfe on a deserted farm track in Rettendon last December, either carried out the 1994 shooting himself or arranged it, and then planted the gun on one of Tate's other pals, it is claimed. A friend of Tate claims Tucker was jealous of Tate's friendship with the other man. The shooting paints a picture of Tucker as a jealous man capable of doing anything to make sure he got his own way. The incident happened in December 1994 as Pat Tate was at home preparing to go to Tucker's party in London. He was in his bathroom shaving when the glass was shattered and a bullet hit his arm. Tate's friend, a woman who does not want to be identified for fear of reprisal, says Tucker stoked Tate's fear and paranoia after the shooting by giving him a gun to protect himself while he was in hospital. She also claims that Tucker supplied Tate with drugs while he was in his hospital bed. The gun which fired the bullet was then allegedly planted at the home of a friend of Tate's. The pal was allegedly questioned about the shooting, but no one was ever charged. Tate had not been long out of prison when the bathroom shooting occurred. He had been jailed in November 1990 for 6 years for robbery and drugs charges, but was let out in July 1994 on licence. When the pistol and drugs were found, Tate's licence was revoked and he was sent back to prison to serve the remainder of his sentence. He was finally released on October the 31st last year, weeks before he and 2 other men were shot dead, their bodies discovered in a Range Rover. Police believed the Rettendon shooting was part of a drugs turf war. Tate's mother Marie confirmed that Tucker had supplied her son with drugs and the gun which was found under his hospital bed. She said, quote, "Pat could see no wrong in Tony, even when Pat was caught with the drugs and the gun. Tony said he would own up and take the blame to keep Pat out of prison, but he never did." End quote. Now, I don't know how accurate that newspaper article is, but obviously this gun and the drugs got there somehow, so it isn't really beyond the realms of possibility to suggest that Tony Tucker was indeed the individual who gave those items to Pat Tate. Now, it may not have been intentional for Tate to get arrested with these items and recalled to prison, but what I do find intriguing about this article is the last few lines where we hear from Pat Tate's mother Marie. It's where she states the following. Tate's mother Marie confirmed that Tucker had supplied her son with drugs and the gun which was found under his hospital bed. She said, quote, "Pat could see no wrong in Tony, even when Pat was caught with the drugs and the gun. Tony said he would own up and take the blame to keep Pat out of prison, but he never did." Now, with everything that we've heard so far, it's pretty clear here that there is some underlying mistrust between Tony Tucker and Pat Tate. We've got Tate who's recalled to prison with this gun. Did he blame that on Tucker somehow? Was he thinking that actually Tucker was to blame? Did Tucker actually say that he was going to own up to this gun and take the blame himself to keep Tate out of prison? Well, quite clearly that never happened. And then during his time in prison, he probably hears that Tucker's out spending £250,000 on this new house. You know, 250 grand back in 1995 was worth quite a lot of money. I think that house now, from memory, is worth well over £1 million. So let's just put yourself in Tate's position for one moment. You've been recalled back to prison. You've got Tucker on the outside, living the life. He's got this lovely new detached bungalow, lovely, bit of land. And Tate is there, I guess, alone with his thoughts in prison. And now we move on to the situation surrounding Leah Betts. We've got Tony Tucker being public enemy number 1. We've got the media frenzy, the media circus surrounding the death of Leah Betts. And I guess this is best demonstrated with a few paragraphs from the book Blogs 19. Even the most laid-back member of the firm was feeling distinctly uncomfortable. Normally, Tony Tucker was so distant from any actual drugs sold in his clubs that it wouldn't have been a problem. But Raquel's was different. The main dealer there, Mark Murray, had suffered a string of police raids on his employees, losing more than 2,500 pills worth, more than £40,000 in just a few weeks. It meant that he hadn't been able to pay Tucker his usual rent and had gone into the red. A compromise was reached. Tucker would supply Murray with his ecstasy direct, with Murray buying the pills at twice the usual rate in order to make up the debt. Murray reluctantly agreed. He had long realised that it made good business sense to sell tablets that were as weak as possible. They cost the same, but it meant that punters would buy 2 or 3 each during the course of an evening, and his profits would be far higher. Tucker's pills were much stronger, so strong that one would let you rave all night long. It would take forever for Murray to repay his debt, but Tucker was determined to get his money back, so he had no choice. The problem Tucker was facing was that everyone knew that his pills were the apples that Leah had taken and that everyone was now talking about. It was only a matter of time before the police found out too. Tucker was certain that he was going to be betrayed. Everyone around him became a potential grass. Every knock on the door was a potential raid. Tucker, very much the brains behind the organisation, was starting to let it all get to him. The paranoia was highly infectious. By the time Darren Nichols arrived at Steele's house early on Monday evening, the master smuggler's mood had gone from bad to worse. Darren Nichols states, "Mick was pacing up and down and showing me the pictures of this girl on the front of the local paper. He was really angry, stamping around, swearing, ranting and raving. He was saying, 'This is bang out of order. This is going to mess it up for the rest of us.' Mick was particularly upset because of Leah's dad being an ex-copper. He was convinced that the bloke would pull in all sorts of favours, and thanks to the wall-to-wall publicity the whole case was getting, make sure the gang behind the pills was caught. And as far as Mick was concerned, if one of them got done and the police started looking into their associates, then he'd be in the frame too. So interestingly here, we have Michael Steele, who up until this point, since being released from prisoners, run a quite nice, quiet little operation. He's bringing this stuff in abroad, he's got this mode of doing it, it hasn't gone wrong thus far. But now, all over the papers is Leah Betts. Steele has heard that it is Tony Tucker who is responsible for supplying the tablet. He realises that if one of these individuals get pulled in, it's not going to be long until they come knocking on his door. Now, I don't know how true this is, but I remember watching a documentary on the Essex Boys quite some time ago, and they said that Mark Murray was a cousin of the Blundalls. So with everything we know thus far, we have the dud cannabis deal. We have Pat Tate, who may or may not have paid back his investors, who are most likely the Blundalls. We also have this issue with Tony Tucker and Mark Murray, who may be a distant relation of the Blundalls or somehow connected to the Blundalls. We have this sort of mistrust between Tate and Tucker in the first place. And we also have the phone call on December the 6th, the very phone call at just after 2 p.m, supposedly, which was to arrange the meet for later that evening. That phone call went to none other than Tony Tucker himself.
Raquel's regular drug dealer owed the Essex Boys money, but with police all over the club, he couldn't work and he couldn't pay his debt. When the Essex Boys threatened him and his family, he turned to the one man in Essex he knew could help him.
I said to him, yeah, it can be sorted out. I said, I'll make a phone call now and get it sorted out for you. I made a phone call and a guy turned up on a motorbike with a crash helmet with a 9mm gun.
Blundell provided the terrified dealer with the gun, the chaperone and some simple advice.
When they turn up, shoot one of them straight in the cobblers. You ain't gonna kill them, just shoot them straight in the cobblers, or even both of them.
The dealer declined this helpful offer. Instead, Blundell called the Essex Boys to a meeting. Only Tate turned up, and Blundell took the chance to warn him that his association with Tucker was dangerous.
He didn't seem to care much, and I said to him, you know, it's all right him keep blanking and all that, but what happens if someone creeps up behind him and goes bang in the back of the head? If you're with him, you're going to get it as well. You know what I mean? I said, well, if it happens, it happens. 3 days later, it happened.
They were found in this Range Rover. All 3 men were shot through the head at point-blank range. Detectives believe the killings have all the hallmarks of a gangland murder.